In the golden dawn over Bethlehem's rolling hills, a young shepherd named David, only 17, tended his flock with gentle hands and a heart full of songs to God. The sky shimmered like brushed bronze, and the sheep grazed quietly on dew-kissed grass. David's brown eyes reflected both kindness and courage far beyond his years. As the wind carried the scent of wild thyme, his harp sang softly, a melody of faith and wonder. Little did he know that this day, meant for simple shepherding, would lead him toward destiny. A meeting with a giant that would echo through all generations. Yet, here in this calm valley, his faith was already being shaped, one song and one prayer at a time. As the sun climbed higher, David's father, Jesse, called from their home near Bethlehem's gate. "David, my son!" His voice carried urgency and love. Jesse, a strong, bearded man of 60 with kind but weathered eyes, stood at the doorway with loaves and dried grain packed for the battlefield. "Your brothers are with King Saul's army. Go, take this food and see how they fare." David bowed respectfully. His heart, steady and faithful, stirred with purpose. He gathered his satchel, tucked the bread inside, and kissed his father's hand. He didn't yet know this errand of care would lead him straight into Israel's greatest test of courage. David walked swiftly along dusty paths, the bag of food slung across his shoulder. The road wound through fields of barley and olive trees. Birds scattered before his steps, and the distant echo of armor clashing from the valley stirred his heart. Yet, even as fear whispered, faith sang louder. "The Lord is my shepherd," he murmured. His voice mingled with the hum of cicadas. He was only a shepherd boy, but his heart burned with the courage of a king. Each step drew him closer to a story that would change Israel forever. As David neared the valley of Elah, a thunderous voice rolled through the air. The ground trembled under his sandals. Across the wide valley stood a giant, Goliath, towering over 9 feet tall, armored in bronze from head to toe. His laughter was cruel, his spear thick as a weaver's beam. The Israelites trembled on one hill, the Philistines on another. David froze, awe and shock mingling within him. "Who is this man that defies the armies of the living God?" he whispered. The boy's heart, filled with faith, began to stir with righteous courage. David's brothers saw him and scolded him. "Why are you here, little shepherd?" they hissed. But David's gaze stayed fixed on the giant. "Is there not a cause?" he said softly. Within him, faith blazed brighter than fear. The whispers of doubt faded beneath his certainty that God was with him. The army saw only the impossible, but David saw the Almighty. His small hands tightened on the sling at his belt. Somewhere deep in his heart, he knew this was the moment God had been preparing him for all along. The giant, Goliath of Gath, strode into the valley again, his armor blazing like molten fire beneath the midday sun. His laughter thundered across the hills, echoing off the rocks. "Choose a man to fight me," he bellowed, voice shaking the air. "If he can kill me, we will be your servants. But if I defeat him, you shall serve us." Israel's soldiers shrank back, their shields trembling in their hands. None dared step forward. Yet, far off among them, a young shepherd's heart burned with unshakable faith. David's eyes narrowed. His God was bigger than this boastful man of iron and pride. David looked around at the trembling men and asked, "What shall be done for the man who defeats this Philistine?" His voice was calm, steady, almost too brave for a boy his age. Some soldiers scoffed, but others stared, wondering if the youth was serious. His oldest brother, Eliab, flared with anger. "Why have you come here? I know your pride." But David only said, "Is there not a cause?" The words hung in the air, powerful as any weapon. Even as men mocked, heaven listened. and the first spark of courage began to spread among Israel's fearful ranks. Word of David's boldness reached King Saul. The boy was brought before him inside the royal tent, where light filtered through crimson fabric like fire and gold. Saul, tall and commanding with streaks of gray in his beard, studied the shepherd with doubt. "You are but a youth," he said, "and he a warrior from his youth." But David's eyes shone. "My lord, I kept my father's sheep. When a lion came, I struck it down. When a bear took a lamb, I seized it by the beard and killed it. The Lord who delivered me from them will deliver me from this Philistine." Silence filled the tent. Then Saul nodded slowly. "Go," he said, "and the Lord be with you." Saul placed his own armor upon David, a bronze helmet, a coat of mail, and a sword by his side. The armor hung loose and heavy, far too large for the young shepherd. David took a few steps and shook his head. "I cannot go with these," he said softly, "for I have not tested them." With gentle respect, he removed the armor piece by piece and laid it down. He chose instead his shepherd's staff, his sling, and 5 smooth stones from the brook. For David knew his strength was not in iron or bronze, but in the power of the living God. David stepped out into the sunlight once more. The air shimmered with heat and tension. He knelt by a small brook running through the valley floor. Carefully, he chose 5 smooth stones, each shaped by time and water's patience. He placed them in his leather pouch and looked toward the giant's camp. Birds circled high above. "The Lord who made the heavens and earth," he whispered, "is my defender." The world seemed to hold its breath. The boy's faith stood firm as rock. Soon, one of these very stones would change history forever. David stepped forward into the valley. Staff in hand, sling at his side, his heart steady with faith. The sun blazed high as the armies watched in stunned silence. Across the valley, the massive form of Goliath, the Philistine champion, moved like a mountain of bronze. When the giant saw David's youth, he roared with laughter that shook the air. "Am I a dog that you come to me with sticks?" he jeered, lifting his spear high. David did not flinch. "You come to me with sword and spear," he called out, his voice strong and clear. "But I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts." Even the wind seemed to pause, carrying the boy's words across the battlefield. Goliath's laughter thundered again, shaking the spears of men around him. But David took another step forward. His eyes blazed with faith brighter than sunlight. "This day," he said, "the Lord will deliver you into my hand, that all may know there is a God in Israel." His small figure stood fearless before the Colossus. In that moment, heaven seemed to watch in silence. A shepherd's faith challenging an army's fear. David reached into his pouch and drew 1 smooth stone. Chosen, simple, perfect. He placed it in his sling, eyes never leaving the giant's face. Time seemed to slow. Goliath lifted his spear, stepping forward with a roar that shook the ground. But David ran quickly toward him, swinging the sling with practiced grace. Around and around it whirled, faster and faster, faith spinning into action. In a heartbeat, he released it. The stone cut through the air like lightning, guided by unseen strength. The stone struck true, a perfect shot to Goliath's forehead. The giant froze, eyes wide in disbelief. His massive frame swayed once, twice, then thundered to the ground like a collapsing mountain. Silence fell over the valley. The Philistines gasped. The Israelites stared, mouths open. A shepherd boy had brought down a warrior of iron. David stood still, chest heaving, eyes lifted to heaven. "The battle is the Lord's," he whispered. A shout rose from the hills, first one voice, then hundreds. "Israel prevails." The Philistines turned and fled, their pride crushed in the dust. David stood still, small amid the thunder of victory, his sling dangling loosely by his side. He had not fought for glory, but for God's name. The valley that once echoed with fear now rang with faith. Heaven itself rejoiced over one shepherd's trust, a boy who believed that with God, nothing was impossible. As silence settled over the valley, King Saul stood motionless upon the hill, his eyes wide with disbelief. The echo of Goliath's fall still rolled faintly through the air. "Whose son is this youth?" Saul whispered, awe softening his warrior's voice. When David was brought before him, still dust-streaked and breathless, the king rose to his feet. "Tell me your name, my son," he said. David bowed humbly. "I am David, son of Jesse of Bethlehem." Saul placed a hand upon his shoulder, his face both proud and puzzled. "You have fought the Lord's battle and prevailed." Around them, soldiers knelt in respect, realizing they had witnessed a miracle born of faith. In the days that followed, Saul's son Jonathan met David. As their eyes met, their hearts were knit together in friendship, the kind that only truth and faith can forge. Jonathan, noble and brave, saw not a shepherd but a brother chosen by God. He removed his royal robe and placed it upon David's shoulders, along with his own sword and bow. "You shall be as my own soul," he said warmly. David's heart overflowed with gratitude. In a world of kings and warriors, they had found something rarer than gold. True friendship rooted in God's love. As Saul's army returned home, the streets of Israel overflowed with joy. Women came dancing and singing, tambourines in hand. Their voices rose high. "Saul has slain his thousands, and David his 10,000s. Laughter and song filled the air like fragrance. David smiled shyly, unused to such praise, while Saul's heart began to darken with envy. Yet, in that moment, Israel rejoiced, for their God had delivered them from fear. The melody of victory echoed across the land, the song of faith triumphant. That night in Saul's palace, the torches burned low, and music echoed through the marble halls. David played his harp as he often did, his melody gentle and healing. But Saul sat in darkness, his thoughts twisted with envy. "They praise him more than me," he muttered. His grip tightened around the spear in his hand. When the shadow of jealousy overcame him, Saul hurled the spear across the chamber, but David swiftly moved aside, the weapon thudding into the wall. Breathless, the boy stared at the king he loved. Without a word, he left, the music of peace silenced by the storm of jealousy. That same night, David fled from the palace under moonlight. The wind whispered through the olive trees as he ran, heart pounding yet steady with faith. Behind him, Saul's anger burned. Before him, the wilderness stretched wide and unknown. But David trusted that the same God who guided his stone against the giant would guide his steps now. His journey into exile would be hard. Yet even here, God was shaping a king after his own heart. David wandered through the wilderness, weary and hunted, until he found shelter in the caves of Adullam. The wind howled through the rocky cliffs, but within, the flicker of a small fire glowed softly. Alone, David lifted his harp and began to sing. "The Lord is my rock, my fortress, and my deliverer." Though danger pressed from every side, peace filled his heart. Soon men from across Israel came to him, the broken, the brave, the faithful, seeking a leader who trusted in God. In the shadows of the cave, a small band of hope began to form, guided not by power, but by faith. Meanwhile, King Saul's fury grew. He marched across the land with 3,000 chosen men determined to find David. But no matter how far Saul searched, the Lord's hand shielded his servant. The mountains hid David, the valleys whispered his path, and the stars seemed to guard his every step. Saul could not see that he was not chasing a rebel. He was chasing God's plan, and that plan could not be undone. One night, Saul entered the very cave where David and his men hid. His armor clinked softly in the dark as he lay down to rest, unaware that the one he hunted was only steps away. David's men whispered, "This is your chance. Strike him!" But David shook his head. "I will not harm the Lord's anointed." Silently, he crept forward and cut a corner from Saul's robe. His mercy shone brighter than any sword. When Saul left the cave, David stepped out into the light and called, "My lord, the king." His voice trembled, not with fear, but with grace. When Saul was far from the cave, David stepped into the sunlight and lifted the torn piece of robe. "Hi! See, my father," he cried. "I could have harmed you, but I spared your life. Why do you hunt me?" Saul turned, eyes wide and trembling. Tears filled them as he saw David's mercy. "You are more righteous than I," he said softly. In that sacred moment, the angry king wept before the boy he once called enemy. The mountains echoed with the sound of forgiveness. David returned to the wilderness, trusting the Lord to guide every step. The days were long, and the nights cold, but his heart stayed steady. Beneath the stars he wrote songs of faith, psalms that would one day comfort all who walk through valleys of fear. His harp became his shield, his prayers his fortress. Though the crown was still far off, the shepherd of Israel was learning to trust the shepherd of his soul. Years passed, and David continued to flee, yet always showing mercy. One fateful day, news came from the battlefield. King Saul and his sons had fallen on Mount Gilboa. The cry of Israel rose through the hills. When David heard, he tore his garments and wept. "How the mighty have fallen," he lamented. His heart ached for the man who had once loved him, for the father of his dearest friend, Jonathan. Though Saul had hunted him, David mourned him as one mourns family. For even in sorrow, David's heart sought to honor the one whom God had once anointed. David lifted his harp and sang a song of grief for Saul and Jonathan. "O beauty of Israel, slain upon your high places, I am distressed for you, my brother Jonathan. Your love to me was wonderful." His voice broke, yet his words rose like incense to heaven. Even in loss, he chose love over bitterness, honor over vengeance. The mountains of Gilboa became sacred that day, a place where a king in waiting showed the heart of God. After many years of wandering, the people of Judah came to David in Hebron. "The Lord has said, 'You shall shepherd my people.'" They declared. David knelt before the prophet and the elders, his head bowed. The horn of oil was poured over his curls, shining like liquid gold. The Spirit of God rested upon him again, as it had when he was just a boy in Bethlehem. David was no longer the shepherd fleeing through caves. He was now the shepherd of a nation, chosen by the hand of God. David ruled from Hebron for 7 years, then captured Jerusalem and made it the city of David. The Ark of the Covenant was brought there with song and joy. Dancers filled the streets. Trumpets sounded across the hills. David himself danced before the Lord with all his might, his heart overflowing with gratitude. This was not the victory of a warrior. It was the worship of a shepherd who had never forgotten his God. In the quiet of his palace, David prayed, "Who am I, O Lord, that you have brought me this far?" That night, the prophet Nathan came with a message. God would establish David's house forever. Through his line would come the promised king, the savior of all. David fell to his knees, tears of gratitude streaming down his face. From shepherd to king, from field to throne, every step had been guided by the hand of the Almighty. His faith, once small as a stone, had built the foundation for God's everlasting kingdom. Years passed, and David reigned in wisdom and strength. His palace in Jerusalem echoed with songs of peace and praise. The boy who once faced lions and giants now ruled with gentleness and justice. Yet his heart still belonged to the same shepherd who had led him from the fields. Each morning David walked upon the palace roof, gazing toward the hills of Bethlehem, remembering where it all began. Though crowned with gold, he remained humble, knowing his greatest treasure was the Lord who had never left his side. As the harp rested once more in his hands, David sang a song of thanksgiving. "The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? The Lord is the strength of my life." His voice, once youthful and bright, now carried the warmth of wisdom. The melody drifted through palace halls and out into the streets of Jerusalem. It was the same heart that had sung to sheep beneath starlit skies, only now the world listened. Every note reminded Israel that victory, peace, and hope flow only from God. One quiet night, David looked upon the stars and remembered the promise God had made, that through his descendants an everlasting kingdom would rise. "Your throne shall be established forever," the prophet had said. David smiled, understanding that his life was but one verse in God's eternal song. The same God who guided his sling now guided the future of all mankind. In his heart, David saw beyond his crown to a greater king yet to come, a son who would reign forever in truth and mercy. When David grew old and his days were fulfilled, he called his son Solomon to his side. "Be strong and show yourself a man," he said softly. "Walk in the ways of the Lord your God." His voice trembled, yet peace filled the room. As the evening light dimmed, David closed his eyes, resting in the promise of his shepherd. From shepherd boy to king, from battle to blessing, his life had been a song of faith. And though his harp grew still, its melody would echo through eternity. Long after David's harp fell silent, his songs remained psalms of courage, sorrow, and praise. And from his lineage, centuries later, a child was born in Bethlehem, Jesus, the son of David, the Savior of the world. The promise had come full circle. The boy who once defeated a giant with faith alone had become the root of a greater victory, one that would conquer sin and death forever. Through David's story, we see God's faithfulness that never fails, and his love that turns even the smallest stone into the foundation of salvation.